Hi, I'm Adele Perry. I'm a professor of history at the University of Manitoba. I'm a non-Indigenous settler person from British Columbia. I've lived here on Treaty 1 territory, on the territories of the Anishinaabe, Cree, and Dakota people on the homeland of the Métis Nation for about 15 years. And it is from here in my office at St. John's College that I am going to read my section of the TRT summary report. And that is the Doctrine of Discovery, pages 245 to 248. So, the Doctrine of Discovery. Earlier in this report, we recalled how European states relied on the Doctrine of Discovery and the concept of terra nullius, lands belonging to no one, to justify empire building and the colonization of Aboriginal peoples and their lands in North America and across the globe. Far from being ancient history with no relevance or reconciliation today, the Doctrine of Discovery underlies the legal basis on which British Crown officials claimed sovereignty over Indigenous peoples and justified the extinguishment of their inherent rights to their territories, lands, and resources. Speaking to the Manitoba National Event in 2010, former day school student, political leader, and educator Saul Sanderson explained the importance of making the connections between the policies and practices of imperialism and colonialism, and the need for transformative change in Canadian society. What were the objectives of those empire policies? Assimilation, integration, civilization, Christianization, and liquidization. Who did those policies target? They targeted the destruction of our Indigenous families worldwide. Why? Because that was the foundation of our governing systems. They were the foundations of our institutions and of our societies, of our nations. Now those policies still form the basis of Canadian law today, not just in the Indian Act that outlawed our traditions, our customs, our practices, our values, our language, our culture, our forms of government, our jurisdictions. They say we have constitutionally protected rights in the form of inherent rights, Aboriginal rights, and treaty rights, but we find ourselves in court daily defending those rights against the colonial laws of the provinces and the federal government. Now, we can't allow that to continue. From 2010 to 2014, the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues undertook a number of studies and reports on the Doctrine of Discovery. During the same time period, the settlement agreement, churches also began to examine the Christian thinking that had justified taking Indigenous lands and removing children from their families and communities. Writing about the Roman Catholic foundations of Aboriginal land claims in Canada, historian Jennifer Reid explains why the doctrine remains relevant today. Most non-Aboriginal Canadians are aware of the fact that Indigenous peoples commonly regard land rights as culturally and religiously significant. Fewer non-natives, I suspect, would consider their own connections with property in the same light, and fewer still would regard the legal foundations of all land rights in Canada as conspicuously theological. In fact, however it is, the relationship between law and land in Canada can be traced to a set of 15th century theological assumptions that have formed their way into Canadian law. The Doctrine of Discovery was the legal means by which Europeans claimed rights of sovereignty, property, and trade in regions they allegedly discovered through the Age of Expansion. These claims were made without consultation or engagement of any sort with the resident populations in those territories, the people to whom by any sensible account the land actually belonged. The Doctrine of Discovery has been a critical component of historical relationships between Europeans, their descendants, and Indigenous peoples, and it underlies the legal relationships to this day, having smoothly and relatively uncritically transitioned from Roman Catholic to international law. In 2010, the Permanent Observer Mission of the Holy See, the UN representative of the Roman Catholic Vatican, issued a statement regarding the Doctrine of Discovery at the 9th session of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. The statement noted that the earlier papal bulls regarding territorial expansion and the forced conversion of Indigenous peoples had subsequently been abrogated or annulled by Roman Catholic Church. Regarding the question of the Doctrine of Discovery and the role of the papal bull Inter Cotera, the Holy See notes that Inter Cotera, as a source of national law, was first of all abrogated by the Treaty of TRC in 1494, and that circumstances have changed so much that to attribute any juridical value to such a document seems completely out of place. In addition, it was also abrogated by other papal bulls, for example, Sublimis Deus in 1537, which states, Indians and all other people who may later be discovered by Christians are by no means to be deprived of their liberty or have their possession of their property. Should the contrary happen, it shall be null and have no effect. The view was expanded upon and reinforced in Immersa Pastorum of Pope Benedict XIV on the 20th of December, 1741, and a number of other papal encyclical statements and decrees. If any doubt remains, it is abrogated by Canon 6 of the Code of Canon Law of 1983, which abrogates in general all preceding papal and disciplinary laws. Therefore, for international law and for the Catholic Church law, the bull Inter Cotera is a historic remnant with no juridical, moral, or doctrinal value. The fact that juridical systems may employ the doctrine of discovery as a juridical precedent is now, therefore, a characteristic of those laws of those states and is independent of the fact that for the Church, the document has no value for centuries. This refutation of this doctrine is therefore now under competence of national authorities, legislators, lawyers, and legal historians. For many, the Catholic Church statement was inadequate. The doctrine's influence in Western law and its destructive consequences for Indigenous peoples have been well documented by scholars and other experts. In 2014, the North American representative to the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, Grand Chief Edward John, tabled a study on the impacts of the doctrine of discovery on Indigenous peoples, including mechanisms, processes, and instruments of redress. The study concluded, with regard to land dispossession, forced conversions of non-Christians, the deprivation of liberty, and the enslavement of Indigenous peoples, the Holy See reported that an abrogation took place over the centuries and to invalidate such nefarious actions. Such papal renunciations do not go far enough. There is a pressing need to decolonize from the debilitating effects and ongoing legacy of denial by states of Indigenous peoples inherent sovereignty, law, and title to the lands, territories, and resources. At the same time, there is a growing movement among faith-based bodies to repudiate the doctrine of discovery. In 2010, the Anglican Church of Canada was the first settlement agreement church in Canada to reject the doctrine of discovery and to review the church's policies and programs with a view of exposing the historical reality and impact of the doctrine of discovery and eliminating its presence in its contemporary policies, programs, and structures. In 2013, the Anglican Church established a Commission on Discovery, Reconciliation, and Justice, which had 3 goals. 1, to examine the Anglican Church of Canada's policies and practices and revise them as necessary to be consistent with its repudiation of the doctrine of discovery. 2, to look into questions of what is reconciliation. And 3, to review the Church's commitment to addressing long-standing injustices born by Indigenous peoples in Canada. The Commission of Discovery will table a final report to the Anglican General Synod in 2016. In February 2012, the Executive Committee of the World Council of Churches, or the WCC, also repudiated the doctrine of discovery. The WCC represents over 500 million Christians and in more than 110 countries in 345 member churches, including 3 of the settlement agreement churches. The WCC statement denounces the doctrine of discovery and urged governments to, quote, dismantle the legal structures and policies based on the doctrine of discovery and to ensure that they conform to the United Nations Direct Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The statement expressed solidarity with Indigenous peoples and affirmed their rights to self-determination and self-governance. The WCC also asked its member churches to support Indigenous self-determination in spiritual matters and education of all members of their churches. The United Church of Canada responded to this call. At its meeting in March 2012, the executive of the General Council of the United Church agreed unanimously to disown the doctrine of discovery, a historical concept which has been used to rationalize the enslavement and colonization of Indigenous peoples around the world. At the 11th session of the UN Permanent Forum in May 2012, Kairos, an interchurch social justice advocacy organization, made a joint statement with the Assembly of First Nations, the Chiefs of Ontario, the Grand Council of the Crees Ayu-Ishichi, Amnesty International, and the Canadian Friends Service Committee, Quakers, on the doctrine of discovery. This statement said that while churches have begun to repudiate the racist doctrine, states around the world have not. It recommended that states, in conjunction with Indigenous peoples, undertake legal and policy reform to remove any remnants of doctrines of superiority, including discovery, as a basis for the assumed sovereignty over Indigenous peoples and their lands and resources. In his report to the UN Permanent Forum, Grand Chief Edward John focused on how Canadian courts have dealt with sovereignty issues. Quote, The highest court of Canada has recognized the need for reconciliation of pre-existing Aboriginal sovereignty with assumed Crown sovereignty. The Supreme Court has taken judicial notice of such matters of colonialism, displacement, and residential schools, which demonstrate how assumed sovereign powers were abused throughout history. The root cause of such abuse leads back to the doctrine of discovery and to other related fictitious constructs which must therefore be addressed. At the 13th session of the UN Permanent Forum in May 2014, Haudenosaunee faithkeeper Oren Lyon spoke about the principles of good governance as they relate to the United Nations Declaration. He said, "We recognize the doctrine of discovery and its long-term effects on the peoples led to the atrocities we faced in residential schools and boarding schools both in Canada and the US. The doctrine of discovery has been invoked as a justification for the ongoing exploitation of our lands, territories, and resources, and directly violates Article 7, Paragraph 2 of the UNDRIP. The doctrine of discovery and the related concept of terra nullius underpin the requirements for Aboriginal people to prove their pre-existing occupation of the land in court cases or to have their land and resource rights extinguished in contemporary treaty and land claims processes. Such a requirement does not conform to international law or contribute to reconciliation. Such concepts are a current manifestation of historical wrongs and should be formally repudiated by all levels of Canadian government. Our intention in so concluding is to highlight that there is an important distinction to be drawn between the doctrine of discovery and its related concepts and the several inherently unjust policies, laws, and principles to which they have given rise over the years. It would not be enough to simply repudiate the doctrine of discovery, for example, while still maintaining the requirement for Aboriginal people to prove the validity of their existence and territoriality. We would not suggest that the repudiation of the doctrine of discovery necessarily gives rise to the invalidation of Crown sovereignty. The Commission accepts that there are other means to establish the validity of Crown sovereignty without undermining the important principles established in the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which is that sovereignty of the Crown requires that it recognize and deal with Aboriginal title in order to become perfected. It must not be forgotten that the terms of the Royal Proclamation were explained to and accepted by Indigenous leaders during the negotiation of the Treaty of Niagara of 1764. So that is the end of my section of reading the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's summary of their final report, and I want to thank Erica Violet Lee and Zoe Todd for organizing this important exercise. Thank you.